He was the young son of one of the richest men in the country, weak, sick, and growing up in silence inside a mansion where money solved everything, except what really mattered. Everyone around him followed orders, kept their distance, and stuck to routines. That is, until the day a quiet maid came into his life. She didn't have much, no power, no title, but the boy saw something in her no one else had. One day, after a painful treatment, he made a simple request that shook her to the core. What she did after that moment didn't just change the boy's life. It forced his father to face a truth he had buried for years. And when the truth came out, no one saw it coming. Not the doctors, not the staff, not even the billionaire himself. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. William Carter was one of the richest men in the country. He had everything that money could buy: sports cars, a private jet, a mansion bigger than most hotels, but none of it mattered anymore. Since the death of his wife, Emily, life had lost all meaning. She died just weeks after giving birth to their son Noah because of a fast and aggressive cancer that no one had managed to detect in time. Now William lived in that same enormous house, but it felt empty. Every hallway echoed. The once warm home was now cold and silent. Every wall seemed to have a photo of Emily smiling, and each one reminded him of what he had lost. He tried to keep busy by working harder and investing millions in medical research to fight the disease that took her away. But it never felt like enough. There was always something missing. He felt powerless, broken and alone, even surrounded by wealth and success. Noah, his son, was now just a small boy, barely able to understand the world around him, but already facing a cruel reality. He had inherited not just his mother's eyes and her smile, but also the same disease that had killed her. Doctors discovered it early, but it was still serious. He had to go through constant treatments, medicines, tests, injections, day after day. The man in charge of these treatments was Dr. Richard Hayes, a well-known and respected physician with years of experience. He did his best to make Noah feel safe and cared for, but the procedures were hard. Noah cried often. Sometimes he was too tired to play or even eat. He didn't understand why he was always in hospitals or why he felt so weak. His father, William, stayed distant, watching from the background like a shadow. He wanted to be close, but something in him held him back. It was like he didn't know how to be a father anymore. The house they lived in was full of expensive furniture, tall glass windows, and quiet halls. Everything was perfectly clean and organized, but it didn't feel alive. There was no laughter, no music, no warmth. The staff tried to keep things moving. Meals were served, rooms were cleaned, and appointments were scheduled, but even they felt the sadness that hung in the air. Every room carried a memory of Emily, and William couldn't escape them. He would often stand for long minutes staring at her photos, remembering their life before everything fell apart. At night, he couldn't sleep. He would walk through the mansion in silence, stopping by Noah's room just to watch him breathe. Sometimes he cried alone, quietly. The emptiness around him was louder than any sound. He had everything, but also nothing. Money couldn't fix what was broken. It couldn't bring Emily back. It couldn't cure Noah. All he could do was keep watching, hoping something would change. William thought that maybe, by funding medical research, he could make some kind of difference. He donated to hospitals, sponsored labs, and paid for studies that tried to understand the kind of cancer Emily had. He met with doctors and scientists, asked questions and signed checks without hesitation. But every time he walked into the hospital where Noah was treated, he felt helpless. He wasn't a doctor. He couldn't solve anything with his own hands. All he could do was wait and pay. It made him feel useless, like a bystander in his own life. Dr. Hayes kept him informed, always speaking clearly and with care, but the news was rarely good. The treatments were slowing the disease, but not curing it. William started to fear that he might lose his son too. That thought haunted him day and night. He didn't know how much more loss he could take. His mind kept replaying memories of Emily and imagining a future without Noah. Noah, despite everything, was a sweet and curious child. Even with the pain, he sometimes smiled. He liked drawing with crayons and watching birds through the window. Dr. Hayes tried to make his time during treatments as comfortable as possible, bringing toys and explaining things in a way Noah could understand. But the truth was, he spent more time in hospital beds than in playgrounds. He missed out on what most children experienced. He rarely saw his father up close. William would appear sometimes, watching quietly from a few feet away, but Noah never felt his touch or heard words of comfort. The distance between them grew every day, even though they lived in the same house. The only thing connecting them was the sadness they both carried. One too young to understand it fully, the other too lost to know what to do with it. Hope seemed to be something only other people had. In the Carter mansion, time moved slowly. Each day felt the same, quiet, heavy, and full of pain. William sat alone in his office most hours, staring at reports and emails he barely read. The housekeeper brought him food he didn't eat. Nurses came and went, checking on Noah and updating William, who nodded silently. Dr. Hayes did what he could, but even he felt the weight of the situation. He admired William's strength, but also saw the fear in his eyes. Everyone in that house was waiting for news, for change, for something to break the pattern, but nothing came. Noah continued his treatments. William continued to grieve and work. Emily's memory lived on in every corner. The silence was deep, and the sadness stronger than anything else. In the Carter home there was no laughter, no comfort, and no joy, only the distant hope that maybe, one day, things would be different. But for now, all they had was the emptiness. When the last group of caregivers left, William Carter was forced to find someone new to help with his son. The team had been professional but cold, focused only on treatments and schedules. There was no warmth in their presence. William contacted an agency and asked for someone experienced, reliable, and calm. That was how Grace Miller arrived at the Carter mansion. She didn't speak much during the interview. She listened carefully, nodded gently, and agreed to start immediately. Her presence was quiet, almost invisible at first. She wore simple clothes and moved through the house without making noise. William barely looked at her, only explained what was needed, and left. Grace didn't ask questions. She just observed and learned. She took her time understanding the house, the people, and most of all, Noah. She didn't rush anything. She watched how the boy behaved, how the nurses worked, and how William stayed away. The house was silent, but Grace was patient enough to wait for the right moment to act. Over the next days, Grace began taking on more responsibilities, but not just the cleaning or laundry. She started to sit in the corner of the room when Noah had his treatments. She didn't speak unless spoken to. Sometimes she just hummed softly or told a short story in a low voice. Noah, who usually avoided eye contact, began to glance at her. At first, it was just curiosity. Then, slowly, he started reacting to her presence. He didn't cry as much when she was near. Grace was careful not to overstep. She asked the nurses for permission before helping, and she never pushed Noah to talk. One day, she offered him a small toy after a long session. He didn't say anything, but he held it tightly. William noticed these small moments. He watched from a distance and felt uncertain. He didn't like seeing someone else get close to his son, but at the same time, he couldn't deny that Noah looked a little better. Grace was changing something. Grace continued her calm and steady approach. She started reading books to Noah at night. She chose simple ones, full of colors and animals. At first, Noah just listened with his eyes half closed. Then one night, he asked her to read one again. It was the first time he had made a request in weeks. Grace nodded and read it slowly, making sure to point at the pictures. Sometimes she sang softly when he was too tired. She also helped him with his physical therapy, encouraging him in small ways. "One more step," she would say, holding his hand firmly. Noah started responding more. He gave short smiles, tried harder during exercises, and even whispered a few words to her. The nurses were surprised. William watched this change with mixed feelings. He felt grateful but also afraid. Emily had been the last person to bring that kind of warmth into the house. Seeing Grace reach Noah made him feel like he was losing something again, even though he didn't know exactly what. William tried to keep his distance, as he always had. He told himself that Grace was just doing her job and that it didn't mean anything more. But deep down, he knew things were different. The house didn't feel as silent as before. Sometimes he heard Grace laughing gently with Noah. He saw her sitting beside him, holding his hand during treatment. She didn't act like a nurse or a servant. She acted like someone who truly cared. William didn't know how to feel about it. He didn't interfere, but he also avoided being in the same room for too long. He feared that if he let himself feel again, the pain would return stronger. Grace never asked for attention. She kept her focus on Noah. She didn't try to get involved in William's life. Her entire world, it seemed, became that boy and his recovery. The mansion still felt large and cold, but now it had one small place where something different was growing, a connection that hadn't existed before. One afternoon, after a difficult treatment that left Noah exhausted and in pain, Grace stayed by his side. The room was quiet, the machines still beeping softly. She was wiping his forehead with a cloth when Noah suddenly reached for her hand. His fingers were weak, but he held her tightly. He looked at her with tired eyes and said in a faint voice, "Mommy, promise you'll save me." The words hit Grace like a wave. She froze, unsure of what to say. Her throat tightened, and she couldn't speak for a moment. She looked into his face and saw a mixture of fear, confusion, and hope. Grace wasn't his mother. She wasn't even family. But in that moment, he needed someone to believe in. So, without thinking too much, she leaned closer, hugged him gently, and whispered, "I promise I'll take care of you." She didn't fully understand what that promise meant, but she knew it was real. She meant it with all her heart. That moment stayed with Grace long after Noah fell asleep. She sat in the chair beside his bed, thinking about what he had said. It wasn't just a child's question. It was a plea. It was the deepest expression of trust he had ever given to anyone. She realized then that this wasn't just a job anymore. She had come to the Carter mansion expecting to clean, to cook, to help. But now, everything had changed. Noah needed her in a way no one else did. William, though distant, had allowed her into their lives without knowing what it would lead to. That single request, "Promise you'll save me," had changed something in her. Grace wasn't sure how she would keep that promise. She wasn't a doctor, and she couldn't stop the disease. But she could stay, care, and be the person Noah needed. She had no idea how much this promise would affect her future, but she knew she would never forget that moment, or the boy who asked for hope. As the days went by, Grace started to notice small things that didn't seem right. It began with the medicine. Every time Noah received a certain imported medication, his condition got worse instead of better. At first, she thought it was a coincidence. The doctors said side effects were normal, and Noah's illness was complicated. But the pattern was too clear to ignore. Within a few hours after taking that specific drug, his skin would grow pale, his temperature would spike, and his breathing would become shallow. Grace quietly wrote everything down in a small notebook she kept hidden in her apron pocket. Times, doses, and reactions. She didn't tell anyone at first. She wanted to be sure before saying something that could cause trouble. Still, every time she saw the nurses prepare those injections, she felt a knot in her stomach. Something about it didn't make sense, and deep inside, she started to feel afraid that Noah was being hurt instead of helped. Grace began checking the medication labels more closely. The names printed on the boxes were complicated, but she noticed that some didn't match the doctor's prescriptions. The dosage listed on one bottle wasn't the same as what was written in Noah's treatment file. Some containers had different serial numbers than the ones recorded on the charts. When she compared the leaflets, they seemed to describe similar drugs, but from different manufacturers. The paperwork looked messy and confusing, as if someone had replaced things on purpose. Grace tried to bring up her concerns gently during conversations with the nurses. "Are you sure this is the right medication for today?" she asked one afternoon. The nurse just smiled stiffly and said, "It's all correct, Miss Miller. Please don't worry about that." But her tone was cold. Another time, Grace asked if Dr. Hayes had approved the changes, and the answer was quick. "Of course, everything goes through him." Still, the answers felt rehearsed, and no one looked her in the eye when she asked. Despite the silence around her, Grace didn't stop paying attention. Each night, when the house went quiet, she sat by the window and reviewed her notes. She compared Noah's good days and bad days. She noticed that the bad ones always came after the same medication, one with a silver label and a faint blue logo printed on the box. She searched through the trash and found a few discarded boxes with that same logo. The name printed there was North Axis Pharma, a company she didn't recognize at first. When she asked William about it, he sighed heavily. He said North Axis was one of the pharmaceutical companies that had worked on Emily's treatments years ago. He told her to stop worrying, that these were trusted suppliers. But Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Emily had died despite all those treatments. Now Noah was suffering too, under the same brand name. The connection made her uneasy. She started to wonder if this could really be just another tragedy, or something much darker. William was exhausted, both mentally and physically. Grace noticed how his face had grown thinner and his voice had lost strength. He spent hours in his office, buried in work or sitting in silence. When Grace approached him with her notes, he didn't want to listen. "Grace," he said, rubbing his forehead, "I appreciate how much you care, but you're not a doctor. Dr. Hayes knows what he's doing. Please don't make this harder than it already is." His tone was tired, not angry, but final. Grace felt a mix of frustration and sadness. She wasn't trying to challenge anyone. She only wanted to protect Noah, but she could see how far gone William was. He didn't trust anyone, not even himself. He had lost his wife to the same illness, and now his son was slipping away too. It was easier for him to believe in the system, in the science, in the routine. Admitting that something might be wrong meant facing another unbearable truth. Even with William's warning, Grace couldn't stop herself from investigating. She paid closer attention during deliveries and noticed how often new medicine arrived, even when the old boxes weren't finished. The men who brought them always came late at night, unloading unmarked containers. One evening, Grace decided to stay awake and watch from the kitchen window. Around midnight, a black van pulled into the driveway. Two men wearing company uniforms carried several boxes inside. She stepped closer and saw the label printed clearly on the side, North Axis Pharma. Her heart started to race. She remembered that same name from Emily's records and from the strange boxes in Noah's room. When she asked one of the maids about it the next morning, the woman shrugged. "We don't question the deliveries," she said softly. "It's all arranged through Mr. Carter and Dr. Hayes." Grace nodded, but her mind was spinning. The more she saw, the less sense it made. Something was being hidden and she didn't know why. That night, Grace sat alone in her room, staring at the small notebook filled with her notes. The evidence wasn't enough to prove anything, but it was too much to ignore. The medicine, the labels, the reactions, the company, all of it pointed towards something dangerous. She remembered Noah's weak voice calling her Mommy and asking her to save him. That memory hit her again, harder than before. If she was right, if something wrong was happening, then Noah wasn't just sick. He was being made worse. Grace felt a cold fear spread through her chest, but also a strange determination. She didn't know what she could do yet, but she knew she couldn't stay silent. As she turned off the light, the image of the North Axis boxes stayed in her mind. For the first time, the thought became real. What if Noah's illness wasn't an accident at all, but something caused on purpose? The idea scared her, but it also made her sure she had to find out the truth. Grace couldn't ignore her suspicions any longer. The strange medication, the unanswered questions, and the name North Axis Farmer kept circling in her mind. She needed help from someone who could look deeper into the hospital's files without raising alarms. That was when she thought of Olivia Brooks, an old friend from her hometown. They had grown up together, but life had taken them in different directions. Olivia had become a hospital manager, known for her honesty and attention to detail. Grace hadn't spoken to her in years, but she decided to reach out anyway. One morning, while Noah was resting, she called Olivia and asked if they could meet privately. Her voice trembled as she explained the situation. Olivia listened quietly, and though she didn't say much, her tone showed concern. She agreed to help, but warned Grace to be careful. "If what you're saying is true," Olivia said, "you're touching something very serious." Grace knew that, but she was ready to take the risk. A few days later, Grace visited the hospital while Noah had his regular checkup. Olivia met her in a small office near the administration wing. The room was quiet, the blinds half closed, and the air felt heavy. Olivia had already started digging through some of the hospital's digital records. She showed Grace a list of prescriptions linked to Noah's name. Some of them matched what Grace had written in her notebook, but others didn't. "These aren't part of the standard protocol for his diagnosis," Olivia said, frowning. Grace leaned closer, trying to read the screen. The files were filled with numbers, drug codes, and strange medical terms, but even without full understanding, she could tell something was wrong. Olivia clicked through the files faster, her expression turning serious. "Look at this," she said, opening two different patient records. Both had identical test results, down to the smallest detail, but with different names. "That's impossible," she whispered. "It means the data was copied or manipulated." She found mismatched lab reports, missing test dates, and duplicated medical charts. Even more alarming, one of the test batches used Noah's patient ID number, but the sample dates didn't line up with the days he was actually at the hospital. Grace's stomach turned as she realized what that meant. Someone had switched samples. "Could this just be a mistake?" she asked quietly. Olivia shook her head. "Not this many. This looks intentional." She opened another folder labeled Special Authorizations. Inside were several documents signed under something called Compassionate Treatment Program. Olivia explained that these programs were often used for testing unapproved drugs under special conditions. Grace's hands started shaking. "Unapproved?" she asked. Olivia nodded slowly. "Experimental, sometimes legal, sometimes not." Then she scrolled down and both women froze when they saw a familiar name. Emily Carter. "That's Noah's mother," Grace said, barely breathing. Olivia's eyes widened. "Then this goes back years." The documents mentioned North Axis Farmer repeatedly, listing drug codes and study references that connected both Emily and Noah to the same experimental project. One file described hereditary treatment continuation, suggesting that Noah's therapy might have been part of an ongoing study that began with Emily's case. Grace's voice broke when she asked, "Are you saying they're still testing on him?" Olivia didn't answer immediately. She turned to another set of files that looked older, marked as archived. After searching through dozens of folders, she found a digital report labeled E. Carter Trial 02. When she opened it, both women stared in disbelief. It was a record of an experimental drug trial conducted under Emily's name, complete with medical notes and progress logs. The final page showed a scanned signature from Emily Carter, supposedly authorizing the tests. But Olivia frowned. "Grace," she said softly, "this doesn't match her actual signature style. This looks forged." A forged signature meant Emily had never agreed to those treatments. It meant someone had used her name and condition to run experiments without consent, and now Noah was suffering because of it. Olivia continued reading through the contract. It detailed a partnership between the hospital and North Axis Pharma for testing new oncology medications in terminal patients. In theory, it sounded like humanitarian research, but the fine print revealed something disturbing. The company was allowed to continue data collection through family members if genetic similarities were found. Grace felt sick. That explained why Noah was being given drugs that didn't match his prescriptions. It wasn't about healing him, it was about studying him. Olivia looked at her, speechless. Both women sat in silence for several minutes, trying to process what they had uncovered. For Grace, the weight of the truth was unbearable. Everything Emily and Noah had gone through might have been part of the same cruel experiment, disguised as medical help. By the time Grace left Olivia's office, her heart felt heavy, but her thoughts were clear. She now understood that this wasn't just about sickness or fate. Emily and Noah had been used, manipulated, and betrayed by people they trusted. She thought about William, how broken he already was, and wondered how he would react to this. But most of all, she thought about the promise she had made to Noah. It was no longer just about keeping him safe or comforting him during treatments. It was about uncovering the truth and making sure those responsible paid for what they had done. As she walked through the hospital hallways, Grace kept replaying Olivia's words in her head. "Be careful, Grace. They won't let this go easily." She didn't know what her next step would be, but one thing was certain. She wouldn't stop now. The promise she made that night beside Noah's bed had taken on a new meaning. It had become a promise of justice. Grace knew it was time to tell William what she had found. She couldn't keep the information to herself any longer, not when it involved Noah's life. That morning, while William sat in his office surrounded by paperwork, she walked in holding a small folder. Her hands trembled, but her voice stayed calm. "Mr. Carter," she began, "I need to show you something important." William looked up, tired and distracted, and gestured for her to speak. Grace laid the documents on his desk. Copies of Olivia's findings, the irregular prescriptions, and the files with Emily's name. She explained what she and Olivia had discovered about the switched samples and the strange connection to North Axis Pharma. William's face hardened with every word. At first, he didn't say anything. Then his expression changed from confusion to anger. He pushed the papers away and stood up abruptly. "You're saying I let my wife and my son be used like test subjects?" His voice rose. Grace tried to calm him, but he was too furious to listen. William's anger wasn't only directed at Grace, it came from fear, guilt, and exhaustion. "Do you have any idea what you're accusing me of?" he shouted. "I've done everything to help my son. I've spent millions on his care." Grace tried to explain that she wasn't accusing him, only trying to protect Noah, but the words didn't matter. William pressed the intercom and demanded that Dr. Hayes come to his office immediately. Within minutes, the doctor entered, calm as always, adjusting his glasses. William threw the documents across the desk. "Explain this," he said sharply. Dr. Hayes picked up the papers and skimmed through them, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled slightly and looked at Grace. "I see what's going on here," he said smoothly. "Miss Miller has misunderstood the data. These are standard clinical reports, and the duplicated results are simple system errors. It happens all the time." His tone was polite but dismissive. "She means well," he added, "but she's out of her depth." "That's not true," she said. "Olivia Brooks from the hospital confirmed these inconsistencies herself." Dr. Hayes turned to William, ignoring her completely. "I know Olivia. She's competent, but she's not qualified to interpret this kind of material either. Sometimes administrators see irregularities where there are none. These are sensitive medical trials. Confidential, yes, but nothing illegal." William rubbed his temples, torn between frustration and fatigue. "So you're saying this is nothing?" Dr. Hayes nodded slowly. "Exactly. Your wife's case was unique, and so is your son's. The treatments are complex, and it's easy for outsiders to misread them. I would advise that Miss Miller focus on her actual duties." The conversation ended there. William turned to Grace, his expression cold and embarrassed. "Grace, I think you've done enough. Don't involve yourself in medical matters again." She tried to protest, but he raised his hand. "Please, I can't deal with this right now." That was it. She had been dismissed. When Grace left the office, she felt humiliated and powerless. Everything she had risked to uncover the truth had been erased with a few calm words from Dr. Hayes. Olivia tried to reach William later that afternoon, calling his private line, but he refused to take her call. Grace saw him walk past her in the hallway without saying a word. The silence in the mansion was heavier than ever. She spent the rest of the day by Noah's side, watching him sleep, thinking about what had happened. Part of her wanted to quit, to leave that house and forget everything, but when she looked at Noah's pale face, she knew she couldn't. She remembered his small hand clutching hers, the way he had asked her to save him. Grace couldn't walk away. She had made a promise, and that promise still held her there, even when everyone else doubted her. She felt trapped, but determined. Something inside her refused to let go of the truth. That night, things took a terrible turn. A new medication had arrived earlier in the evening, another one from North Axis. The nurse followed the usual routine, preparing the injection while Grace stood nearby. She wanted to stop it, but had no authority to interfere. Within hours, Noah's breathing became shallow, and his heartbeat grew weak. Panic filled the room. The nurse called for Dr. Hayes, while Grace rushed to hold Noah in her arms. His body trembled slightly, and his small fingers grabbed her sleeve. "Stay with me," she whispered, tears rolling down her face. Dr. Hayes entered moments later, issuing quick orders to stabilize the boy. After several tense minutes, Noah's condition steadied, but he was still unconscious. William stood frozen at the door, pale and speechless. Grace could feel her heart pounding as she looked at the machines keeping Noah alive. She realized then that she couldn't rely on anyone else, not William, not the nurses, and definitely not Dr. Hayes. If she wanted to keep her promise, she would have to act alone. Later that night, after everyone had gone to rest, Grace sat beside Noah's bed. The room was dim, the monitors blinking quietly. She wiped the sweat from his forehead and whispered softly, "I'm here, Noah. I'm not leaving you." Her mind was racing. Every warning, every strange label, every false reassurance, all of it pointed to something bigger. She thought about Olivia's words, about the forged signatures, and about the compassionate treatment program. None of it was compassion. It was exploitation. She looked at Noah's tiny hand resting on the blanket and felt a mix of sadness and anger rise inside her. This little boy had already lost his mother. Now, people who should have been protecting him were using him. Grace clenched her fists. She didn't know how, but she was going to find out who was behind all of this. Her promise wasn't just about saving him anymore. It was about stopping whoever was responsible, no matter the cost. By the time the house grew completely silent, Grace had made her decision. She would continue investigating, even if it meant risking her job or her safety. She knew she was dealing with powerful people, doctors, corporations, maybe even those funding the hospital itself. But she also knew she couldn't trust anyone else to do it. William was too broken to see the truth, and Dr. Hayes was clearly hiding something. Grace quietly gathered her notes, photocopies, and the small notebook filled with her observations. She slipped them into her bag and took one last look at Noah, sleeping peacefully. "I'll fix this," she whispered. As she left his room, she felt a chill run down her back, but she didn't stop. Somewhere deep down, she understood that she was stepping into something dangerous. Still, she had no choice. The promise she made to Noah was now her only purpose, and she was ready to face anyone who tried to silence her. It was still dark outside when Grace found herself cleaning William's office. She often used the early hours of the morning to move quietly through the house, doing small tasks while everyone slept. The silence helped her think, and tonight her thoughts were heavy. She was wiping dust off the bookshelves when her cloth caught on something. One of the wooden panels near the corner of the room felt loose. Curious, she tapped it, and it moved slightly under her hand. Grace looked around, then gently pulled it back. Behind it, hidden deep in the wall, was a small metal safe. It had no labels or instructions, just a dial and a keyhole. Grace didn't know why, but something told her this mattered. She checked the books nearby and searched through the drawers for clues. That's when she noticed an old photo frame sitting on the desk, one she hadn't paid attention to before. Tucked behind the picture was a faded note with 6 numbers written on it. With trembling hands, Grace turned to the safe and slowly entered the numbers. She heard a quiet click. The door of the safe opened, and inside were neatly stacked papers, some sealed in folders, others loose. On top of them was a small bundle of handwritten letters tied with a ribbon. Grace reached in carefully. The first papers she looked at were contracts, official documents between the Carter family and North Axis Farmer. As she scanned through them, her eyes widened. These were agreements for testing experimental treatments, complete with signatures, approval forms, and financial records. Some of the contracts included payments labeled as research support, but it was clear from the language that they were bribes. There were receipts marked with cash transactions and notes about keeping records confidential. Grace's heart pounded as she realized this was proof, real, undeniable proof, that someone had allowed dangerous testing in exchange for money. But it was the stack of letters underneath that made her stop breathing for a moment. The letters were written in a delicate, familiar handwriting. They were from Emily. Grace slowly untied the ribbon and read the first one. Emily talked about her treatments, the fear she had felt, and how the doctors at North Axis had started giving her medications without full explanations. In one letter, she described how her condition didn't seem to match what she had been told. She mentioned hearing staff talk about trials and data, and how she started suspecting that her treatment was not entirely about saving her. As Grace continued reading, she could see Emily's thoughts becoming more urgent. In one of the middle letters, Emily wrote about wanting to tell William, but not knowing how to start. She said she feared he was too involved with the company through donations and support, and she didn't want to accuse him unfairly. Her words were careful, but her fear was clear. She suspected that her illness was being used as a test. Her trust in the system was broken. Grace reached the final letter, written in shaky handwriting. It had been written just days before Emily died. In it, Emily admitted she believed she had been part of an experiment and begged whoever found the letter to stop North Axis from continuing. The last lines were written with emotion that bled through the ink. "If I fail," Emily wrote, "please protect our son from the same fate." Grace's hands shook as she read those words over and over again. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. Emily knew. She had tried to warn someone, but the letters had been hidden in this safe, unread, for years. Grace thought about everything that had happened since she arrived, the medication, Noah's reactions, the strange behavior of the nurses. It all connected now. Emily had known something terrible was happening, and her final request was clear: protect Noah. Grace folded the letter gently, tears filling her eyes. She couldn't imagine the fear Emily had felt when writing it. Still holding the letter, Grace stood up and turned toward the door. She was ready to hide the documents again for the time being, maybe talk to Olivia about what she had found. But the moment she turned, she stopped in place. William was standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes locked on hers, and he looked confused and tired. For a second, neither of them said anything. He looked down and saw the letters in her hand, then looked at the open safe. Grace didn't try to explain. She didn't hide what she had found. William stepped into the room slowly, his eyes scanning the documents on the desk, the folders, and the letters. He looked overwhelmed, as if the air had been pulled from the room. Grace could see it, the shock, the pain, and something else too: guilt. The past he had tried so hard to bury was now open in front of him, impossible to ignore. William walked over to the desk and picked up one of the letters. His hands were shaking. He sat down slowly and read a few lines. Grace didn't move or speak. She just watched him. After a few minutes, he looked up at her with a face full of confusion and pain. "She never gave me these," he said quietly. "I never saw them." His voice was low, like someone speaking to themselves. Grace believed him. It wasn't hard to see that he was truly affected. William ran a hand through his hair, then picked up one of the contracts. "Why would she think I wouldn't believe her?" he whispered. Grace didn't answer. She didn't know the full truth either, but it was clear that Emily had been scared, and she had been right to be. William sat there, reading silently as the reality began to settle in. The company he had trusted, the people he had supported, had used his wife, and now they were using his son. The room felt heavier than ever. Grace stepped closer and gently placed the last letter, the one about Noah, in front of William. He looked at it for a long time before picking it up. When he read those final words, "Protect our son from the same fate," his face broke. Grace had never seen him like that. He wasn't angry or proud. He just looked broken. All the pain he had tried to hide for years came back in that moment. William leaned back in the chair and covered his face with both hands. Grace stood in silence, giving him space. For the first time, he knew everything. There were no more theories, no more guesses, just the truth, ugly, painful, and real. Emily had tried to stop it. She had begged for Noah to be saved, and now Grace was the one standing there with that responsibility. William slowly lowered his hands and looked at her again. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes said everything. The past had returned, and now they both had to face it. William was not the same after reading Emily's letters. The words kept repeating in his mind, especially the final one. "Please protect our son from the same fate." He couldn't ignore it anymore. That same morning, he walked into the hospital and asked to speak with Dr. Hayes. The meeting happened in a private room. William brought a copy of the documents and placed them on the table. "Explain this," he said firmly. Hayes glanced through the pages without much emotion. His expression stayed calm, almost too calm. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, "These papers are not official. If you continue to follow this line, I'll have no choice but to take legal action for defamation, for interfering with treatment, and for putting your son's life at risk." William was stunned. He expected denial, maybe excuses, but not threats. Hayes stood up, straightened his coat, and added, "If you want your son to live, stop digging, let the doctors do their job." Then he walked out without another word. That same week, strange things began to happen. Grace noticed a black car parked across the street from the Carter mansion 2 nights in a row. At first, she thought it was just a coincidence, but then she saw the same vehicle following her when she went to the pharmacy. Olivia also received anonymous messages on her phone, short texts telling her to stop investigating, calling her by name, even mentioning her family. One message read, "This is bigger than you. Stay out." Grace's heart raced every time she left the house. She tried not to show fear around Noah, but the feeling of being watched was constant. She told William, and for the first time, he didn't question her. He simply nodded and told the mansion staff to change security protocols. He also sent someone he trusted to check Olivia's house and install cameras. Something serious was going on. William began to understand that this wasn't just a medical cover-up. It was a dangerous operation, and they had already gotten too close to the truth. A few days later, Dr. Hayes informed the family that he wanted to transfer Noah to a special unit for further care. He said the team there had more experience with advanced cases and that the move was necessary for Noah's survival. Grace didn't believe it for a second. She shared her concern with Olivia, who immediately started digging. She discovered that the so-called special unit was not part of any public hospital system. It was a private facility run under the name of a research center linked to North Axis Pharma. No patient records were accessible, and the place had no public reviews or contact details. Olivia brought the information to William. "If you let them move Noah," she said, "you may never see him again." That hit William hard. He sat in silence for a long time before finally saying, "They're trying to erase everything." It was at that moment he made a choice. He would protect Grace, he would protect Olivia, and he would protect Noah, no matter what. That night, Noah had another crisis. His breathing became shallow and his lips turned blue. The nurses rushed in, trying to stabilize him. Grace stayed by his side, holding his hand, refusing to move. William entered the room and stood by the door, frozen as he watched the boy struggling for air. Grace looked up at him with tears in her eyes and said, "Please, we have to stop the medication. It's making him worse. You've seen it." William didn't respond right away. He looked at the machines, at the boy gasping for air, and then at the tray of medicine that had just been prepared. Finally, he turned to the nurse and said, "Hold the treatment, no more of it until we understand what's going on." The nurse hesitated, then obeyed. Grace cried quietly, feeling both relief and fear. It was a small victory, but an important one. William had finally taken a side, and he had chosen to trust her. After the crisis passed and Noah was stable again, the three of them, William, Grace, and Olivia, sat in the office to plan their next move. They knew they couldn't wait any longer. Olivia began gathering all the files she could from the hospital system, printing and saving copies to external drives. Grace organized the letters from Emily and the contract papers found in the hidden safe. William contacted a lawyer he trusted, someone from outside the city, and explained that they might need legal protection soon. They knew this wouldn't be easy. North Axis had money, influence, and power. But the trio also had something important: the truth. They made a decision to go public, to bring everything to light: illegal drug trials, forged signatures, patient abuse, and threats. Grace felt the weight of what they were doing, but she didn't back down. William was focused and determined. Olivia stayed calm and methodical. Together, they were ready to act, but one thing still stood in their way: time. And Noah was running out of it. Noah's health was getting worse. His energy dropped every day. Even though they stopped the suspicious medication, the damage was already deep. He barely spoke, and most days he slept for hours without waking. Grace stayed by his side, reading stories, playing soft music, and helping him drink water. William spent more time in the room now, sitting silently, watching his son with a look of guilt and sorrow. Olivia called daily, updating Grace on every move she made, every file she saved, and every backup she created. But strange calls kept coming. People knocked on her door late at night and walked away before she could answer. Someone even broke into her car, though nothing was stolen. The message was clear. They were being watched closely. Still, none of them stopped. They were closer to the truth than ever before. Grace looked at Noah and whispered the same words every night. Hold on a little longer. Time was running out, but the fight was far from over. With all the evidence gathered, Grace, William, and Olivia knew it was time to go public. They needed someone who could take the information and expose it to the world, someone with credibility who couldn't be easily bought or silenced. That's when Olivia suggested Mark Delgado, a well-known investigative journalist who had uncovered several medical and political scandals over the past decade. He had a reputation for going after the truth, no matter the risk. Grace contacted him first, and after a quick phone call explaining the basics of what they had, Mark agreed to meet them in a discreet location. The meeting happened in a small, quiet cafe far from the hospital or Carter mansion. They brought everything: the printed emails, photocopied contracts, screenshots of altered test results, and most importantly, Emily's final letter. Mark read in silence, occasionally asking a question or scribbling something in his notebook. When he finished, he looked at them and said, "This is going to be big, but you need to be ready. It won't be quiet." He contacted a few sources inside the hospital, cross-referenced internal data with what Olivia had saved, and verified the authenticity of the letters. Then, without warning, he released the first part of the story on his website and social media. The headline read, "Hidden Trials: How North Axis Farmer Used Wealthy Patients as Test Subjects." The article included redacted versions of the contracts, names of doctors involved, and photos of Emily's letter. Within hours, the story went viral. News outlets picked it up, and social media exploded with outrage. People wanted answers. The hospital released a brief statement denying everything, but it wasn't enough. More reporters began digging. Grace's phone didn't stop ringing. Olivia's inbox filled with requests from other journalists. William watched the chaos unfold, but didn't speak much. He knew what was coming. He also knew it was necessary. The truth was finally out, and there was no turning back. The exposure had immediate consequences. One day after the article was published, Dr. Hayes tried to flee the country. Airport security flagged his name after a federal order was placed on travel watch lists. He was stopped before boarding a private flight and taken into custody. When searched, he was found carrying several vials of unregistered medication and digital files hidden in encrypted drives. Investigators also discovered contracts linking him directly to North Axis Farmer, showing that he was not just a consultant, but an active partner in several of their unapproved trials. The evidence included payments marked as research bonuses and internal memos discussing test results and patient profiles. His arrest made headlines instantly. Grace and Olivia watched the news, shocked by how fast things were moving. William sat quietly, holding one of Emily's letters in his hand. "She tried to warn us," he whispered. For Grace, it was a small victory. One of the people responsible was finally facing justice, but the fight was not over yet. 2 days later, federal prosecutors entered the hospital with a court order. They moved quickly, sealing off sections of the building and collecting every computer, medical file, and prescription record. Patients were safely relocated to other facilities, and families were informed of the investigation. Doctors and nurses were questioned, some suspended, others placed under review. Olivia stayed in touch with her co-workers and sent updates to Grace as the investigation progressed. More disturbing information came to light. Dozens of wealthy patients over the last 6 years had been unknowingly placed into unauthorized drug trials. Some of them had died without understanding what was really happening to them. Others had survived, but suffered permanent damage. Grace felt sick reading those reports. What happened to Noah and Emily was not an isolated case. It was part of a larger pattern, carefully hidden behind medical terms and fake approvals. The public reaction was fierce. Protests formed outside the hospital. News stations ran constant updates. The story had become a national scandal. Back at the Carter mansion, the atmosphere had completely changed. What was once a place of silence and sadness had turned into the center of a media storm. Reporters camped outside the gates, cameras pointed toward the house at all hours. News vans lined the street and drones hovered overhead trying to get pictures. William's legal team advised him to stay quiet and keep the family out of the spotlight, but he refused. For years, he had hidden from the world, drowning in guilt and grief. Now, he chose to do the opposite. He stood by the front gate with Grace on one side and Noah in a wheelchair beside him. Flashing cameras lit up the yard. Microphones were pushed toward his face. William spoke calmly and clearly. "My family was used and lied to," he said. "My wife deserved better. My son deserves better. I will not rest until those responsible are held accountable, and until my son receives the care he truly needs." She was no longer just the housemaid. She had become a protector, a truth seeker, and someone who refused to back down. Noah sat quietly, a blanket over his legs, weak but alert. He looked around at the people, the cameras, the flashes, but he didn't cry. He just held Grace's hand tightly. The moment was emotional, but it was also powerful. It was the first time the public saw William Carter, not as a distant billionaire, but as a father fighting for his child. The media quickly picked up the speech. It was broadcast across the country. Talk shows and radio hosts debated the case. People sent messages of support. Donations began pouring in to support legal actions against North Axis. Behind the scenes, Grace, Olivia, and William continued collecting everything they had, preparing for trial. But in that one moment, as they stood united outside the mansion, they had already won something important. The world was watching now, and hiding the truth was no longer an option. Away from the influence of North Axis Pharma and the people who had caused so much harm, Noah was transferred to a new medical facility. This time, the choice was made carefully. Olivia helped find a small, independent clinic known for its transparency and ethical work. The doctors there had no ties to pharmaceutical companies and agreed to review Noah's case from the beginning. William was involved in every decision. He sat through the consultations, asked questions, and insisted that nothing be hidden from him again. Grace went with Noah in the ambulance, holding his hand the entire way. When they arrived, the new doctors immediately ran a series of tests. Within days, they confirmed what Grace and Olivia had suspected. The previous medication had worsened Noah's condition. The treatments from North Axis were not only unnecessary, they were harmful. Now, for the first time, Noah was going to receive proper care based on honest medical analysis. It wasn't a miracle solution, but it was finally the right path. The new treatment plan was different from anything before. It focused on Noah's specific condition without relying on experimental or unapproved drugs. The doctors carefully balanced his medication, nutrition, and rest. He started physical therapy to regain strength and was monitored closely for side effects. Grace stayed with him every day, helping the nurses, learning from the doctors, and making sure Noah felt safe. William visited daily as well, sometimes staying for hours. He no longer stayed in the background. He sat beside Noah, read him books, and listened when the boy wanted to talk. Olivia visited on weekends, bringing files related to their ongoing legal work, but also stopping by to see how Noah was doing. Slowly, something started to change. After just a few weeks, Noah's body began to respond. He stopped vomiting, his energy returned in short bursts, and he started eating more. One morning, he laughed at a joke Grace made during breakfast. It was the first real laugh in months. At the mansion, the atmosphere was completely different. When Noah was well enough to return home part-time, the staff made changes to make him feel more comfortable: softer lighting, colorful decorations, and new toys. William ordered a small playroom to be set up just for him. Grace helped decorate it with drawings and storybooks. The once cold, silent house slowly became warm again. Noah's laughter was now a regular sound in the hallways. He wasn't fully healed, but the improvement was real and noticeable. Even the nurses who visited for follow-ups commented on how different he looked. William no longer hid in his office. He worked from the living room to stay close to Noah. He took calls from lawyers, medical professionals, and news reporters, but he always stopped to help Grace when she needed him. He apologized to her once, not with a long speech, just a quiet, "Thank you for not giving up." Grace smiled and said, "I made him a promise." That was all she needed to say. Inspired by everything they had learned, William decided to take action beyond his own family. He started a new foundation to help other victims of medical fraud. With Olivia's help, he created a support fund for families who had been misled by fake trials or unsafe treatments. The organization also offered legal aid, medical second opinions, and therapy services for those affected by trauma. William used his wealth not just as a donation, but as a tool for real change. Olivia coordinated the legal side, working with lawyers and investigators. Grace gave input as well, especially when it came to emotional support and patient care. She had lived through the pain and fear. Her voice brought humanity to the project. The foundation received public support quickly. After the North Axis scandal, many people were eager to back something that truly protected patients. For William, this wasn't about image. It was about making sure no one else had to go through what his wife and son did. As Noah grew stronger, his personality began to shine through more. He asked more questions, played for longer periods, and even started learning to read basic words with Grace's help. She taught him with patience and joy, always celebrating even the smallest progress. William often joined them during these sessions. Sometimes he helped, other times he simply watched and smiled. The bond between them was stronger now. They were not just a family on paper. They were a real family built through struggle and love. Grace still kept a quiet routine, waking early and making sure everything was ready for Noah's needs. But there was peace in her movements now. She was no longer just reacting to problems. She was helping build a future. Olivia visited often, not just as a professional partner, but as a friend. They all had found something they didn't expect during this battle: connection, healing, and purpose. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it no longer controlled everything. The Carter mansion, once filled with silence and tension, was now filled with life. There were still hard days, especially when Noah had setbacks, but they no longer faced them alone or without answers. There was a sense of control, of trust. Grace would walk through the hallways and hear Noah's voice coming from the playroom or the kitchen. Sometimes it was laughter, other times it was his soft voice calling her name. William, too, was different, less distant, more involved and more open with his emotions. They still kept Emily's memory alive, especially for Noah, who often asked questions about his mother. Grace and William answered with honesty and care, showing him pictures and sharing stories. But now, those conversations weren't only sad, they were filled with love and hope. For the first time in a long time, hope didn't feel fake. It was real. It had been built through action, through truth, and through people who chose to fight not with money or power, but with heart. Months had passed since the chaos, the legal battles, and the painful discoveries. Life had slowly taken on a new rhythm. On a sunny afternoon, Noah was running through the garden behind the Carter mansion. His steps were quick and light, his laughter filled the air, and his energy showed how far he had come. He wasn't just better, he was thriving. The boy who had once spent most of his days hooked to machines was now chasing butterflies and calling Grace to come watch. William sat on a bench nearby, watching closely. He didn't look away, not even for a second. Grace stood under the shade of a tree, smiling at the scene in front of her. She had seen him at his weakest, carried him through the worst, and now, seeing him run again, was something she had once feared might never happen. Olivia arrived minutes later, waving from the garden gate. Everything felt different now. Life had been rebuilt, not perfectly, but honestly, and that made it strong. The North Axis case had become a global headline. Investigations had expanded into other countries. Former executives were being charged. Whistleblowers from different institutions came forward, exposing a long list of hidden experiments, patient manipulation, and unethical trials. The scandal was used in conferences, legal seminars, and medical schools as a turning point in the conversation about ethical standards. News outlets followed the updates regularly. William gave interviews, not to seek sympathy or to clear his name, but to make sure the truth stayed in the spotlight. Olivia worked closely with journalists, lawyers, and lawmakers, helping create guidelines to avoid future abuses. But the biggest step came when they announced the creation of a new foundation, the Emily Carter Institute for Ethical Research. It would focus on transparency in clinical trials, support for families affected by medical fraud, and education for future health professionals. The inauguration event was planned for months, and it finally happened on a day filled with calm skies and quiet excitement. The ceremony was held in a modest but beautiful auditorium, built with donations from people who had followed the story. Attendees included doctors, journalists, survivors, families, and even students. William stood on stage, holding a folder with a few of Emily's letters inside. His hands didn't shake, but his voice was heavy with emotion. He shared parts of Emily's words, not the ones about pain, but the ones where she spoke about her hopes for Noah and her belief that science should always serve life, not business. The room listened in silence. Then William turned to Grace, who stood a few steps behind him, holding Noah's hand. "There was a time when I almost lost my son," he said, "once to illness and once to my own blindness. But Grace never gave up on him. She saved him not just with care, but with courage." People stood and clapped. Grace felt overwhelmed, not by the attention, but by the truth in William's words. She hadn't done it for praise, she did it for Noah. After the applause died down, William gestured to Noah, who walked up slowly to the microphone. He was wearing a small suit and looked slightly nervous, but when he smiled, the entire audience smiled with him. "She promised she would save me," he said clearly, and she did. The crowd clapped again, louder this time. Grace walked over to him and hugged him tightly. Her eyes were full of tears, but it wasn't sadness. It was something deeper. It was relief, joy, and pride all mixed together. In that moment, everything they had been through flashed in her mind. The hospital nights, the arguments, the threats, the secrets, and the fear. But it had all led to this. She looked at William, then at Olivia, and then at the crowd. They weren't just honoring a woman who had passed. They were continuing what she had tried to start. They were doing it in her name, and that meant something real, something lasting. The rest of the event was filled with stories, shared memories, and plans for the future. People came up to Grace to thank her. Some were families who had experienced similar tragedies. Others were professionals who had learned from the case and changed how they worked. Olivia gave a short speech about the importance of fighting for transparency. William answered questions from the press, but the most important moment came afterward, when the three of them, Grace, William, and Olivia, stood outside the building, watching Noah play with a group of children. The sound of his laughter no longer reminded them of what they had lost. It reminded them of what they had saved. Grace sat down on a bench, tired but happy. William joined her. "She would be proud of this," he said quietly. Grace nodded. "I think she already is." There was no more anger, no more hiding. Just quiet understanding between people who had faced darkness and chosen to build something better instead. That evening, they returned to the mansion. It no longer felt like a museum of grief. The pictures of Emily on the walls were still there, but now they brought comfort instead of pain. The staff smiled more. The air felt lighter. Noah walked through the hallways confidently, pointing at drawings he had made or calling Grace to look at something he'd built. She followed him with a calm heart. William stood by the window for a moment, looking out at the yard where his son had once fought to stay alive. Olivia sat at the dining table, reviewing plans for upcoming programs under the foundation. They weren't just a group of people connected by tragedy anymore. They had become something stronger. A family, not built by blood but by choices. Choices to fight, to care, to believe, and to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. For the first time in a long time, there was peace, real peace, and with it, a future they could finally believe in. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.